Assignment education on KET is made possible with generous support from
COSARE.org/kids.
COSARE Charities has given my daughter the opportunity to reach her full potential on everything. I know that she's destined to do great things.
COSARE.org/kids.
The Vay Neighbor Carter Group at Baird. Wealth management with quality, perspective, honesty, and integrity. The Vay Neighbor Carter Group.rwbaird.com.
I'm Sam Corbett on Assignment Education, the show that shines the spotlight on positive things happening in schools throughout the Commonwealth. We'll examine important issues related to education while always seeking out the good news. This time, we talk to the chairperson of Kentucky's Board of Education about making up for lost time in the classroom and the challenges of going back to school, moving ahead.
I really believe in the resilience of kids and in the determination of educators.
Plus, Kentucky's Lieutenant Governor, who also happens to be a teacher.
My hope is that we take some lessons from this.
I sit down with Jacqueline Coleman for her perspective on going back to school and what state government is doing to help. Right now, we're at the historic Old Governor's Mansion in Frankfort with Kentucky's 58th Lieutenant Governor, Lieutenant Governor Jacqueline Coleman. Governor, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So you bring, I think, a really unique perspective in your role as Lieutenant Governor and also the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Workforce Development because you're a teacher, you're an educator. Tell us a little bit about your experience prior to becoming Lieutenant Governor.
So before I became Lieutenant Governor, I was a high school civics teacher, which is pretty fitting to be in government now. And I also coached high school girls basketball. Eventually, I moved into a leadership role and became an assistant principal at the high school level right before I decided to run for Lieutenant Governor with Governor Beshear.
So, as I mentioned, you're wearing two hats.
Yes.
You're the Lieutenant Governor, but you're also, obviously, as Cabinet Secretary, heavily involved in Kentucky's education system. As we work our way out of COVID, and our elementary and secondary schools are hopefully going back to what we think is not the old normal, but the new normal. Mm-hmm. What kind of impact has this whole experience had on our schools, on our students, on our educators?
You know, over the last year and a half, what I hope people have recognized and can acknowledge now is the impact that public education has on our communities, on our families, on our workforce, and on our economy. And you know, to know that those young students had such a difficult time dealing with the realities of COVID within their own families, within the classroom, within digital learning that they had to adjust to. The one thing I will say about kids is they are far more resilient than we are. And so my hope is that we take some lessons from this and we don't forget about the gratitude that we owe the folks that work with our kids every day and that get up every day to serve our students. And you know, when we talk about the new normal versus the old normal, what I always say is if we miss the opportunity to look at what's worth not going back to, as much as we think about what's worth going back to, then we will have missed the greatest opportunity that this pandemic has provided us.
Is there one issue or one area that jumps out at you as far as something we do not want to go back to?
I think when you go look at going back to the way that we did things before, there were a lot of things in education that classroom teachers would say, why are we doing this? What is the point in this? And the answer was, well, because we've always done it this way. And that's not the right answer. And so when you look at issues that cause, I think, the most angst in students and teachers, one would certainly be the excessive amount of standardized tests that we give our students. And when we went digital, when we created those relationships and built a more collaborative, innovative education model, that's something that we shouldn't let go. We should morph that into the classroom experience. And again, when we say experience, education should be experiential. right? And so creating those real world opportunities for our kids to problem solve and practice those skills that they're going to need as adults is far more important than whether they circle B on a standardized test or not.
Right. The workforce development part of your cabinet job is obviously critical, and you just touched on this. So what are you hearing from employers as it relates to the skill sets that our students need as they exit high school and move on to hopefully some post-secondary experience? We had a nice conversation with President Aaron Thompson from the Council on Post-Secondary Education, and as you and others talk about all the time, a child can't just stop with a high school diploma.
No.
It requires more. What do you hear from employers?
Right. Well, first of all, they don't get any better than Aaron Thompson, and Kentucky's very lucky to have him. He's a great partner in education for myself and the governor. But when we look at how we transition out of high school into post-secondary life, the first thing we have to acknowledge is that that looks very different for different people. It's no longer a simple this or that option, right? For the longest time, we got into a habit of trying to direct kids either into the workforce or into college, and those were the only two options. And then we got in the back and forth about which is better. And the governor and I always say this: we don't have enough of everything in post-secondary life. And so our goal should be, as those students transition into the workforce, into apprenticeships, into industrial certification programs, associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, it goes on and on. The opportunities are endless, but the one thing that all higher education folks and all employers say is we can teach kids, students, the content that we need them to know. That's our job. What we need is folks that come to us and they can communicate, they can collaborate, they can think critically and problem solve. And so that's one of those points that I just made about we got to think about what's not worth going back to, and really focus our education efforts on building the whole child, right? And building those critical skills that we know are necessary after high school, because every employer would tell you that.
Right. On that building the whole child, one of the concerns I'm sure you have and many of us have in the education space is that based upon COVID, kids were not in school, the social, emotional consequences of everything that's happened. We kind of understand the academic part, but there's this huge social, emotional piece, which I think is something that's important to you. How do we deal with that?
That is one of the questions that we continue to ask, and we have to find an answer to coming out of COVID. And so what I would say is once the President Biden announced the American Rescue Plan, and we understood the amount of funding that would be coming into Kentucky for teaching and learning and for instructional purposes, the governor also got a what we call a GEAR funding, which is the governor's discretionary funding, how he can use however he wants. It was $19.3 million. And so when we sat down to talk about how to best utilize that, that was the point I made, is there's going to be all kinds of funding coming in for teaching and learning. Mm-hmm. We need to think beyond the classroom about the social and emotional toll that this pandemic has had on our students. And so the governor decided to use, we're going to use about $15 million of that, so a huge chunk of it is going to go towards mental health, social and emotional healing, and child care. That is also a workforce issue, because we saw how many women were displaced because of that. But that is an example of the investment that this administration believes is so important to education, and an acknowledgement of how multifaceted education is. And so we're partnering with our family resource youth service centers across the state, and because they do such amazing work that I wish the general public knew what goes on in our Friskies, but they're going to kind of be our vessel to deliver those services to our students and their families.
Great. Let me switch gears a little bit. You're a elected official, you're an educator, but you're also a mom. And you're a mom of a fairly young child.
Yes.
I understand that the mandate for education in Kentucky is K through 12. But I'm a huge supporter and fan of early childhood education.
That makes two of us.
So what's the state's role in early childhood education for children like yours and children throughout the Commonwealth?
You know, I think the state has a growing role in this. It's something that, as you said, we've really focused on K-12, and that's been the mandate, as you said. The important part of this is that we now know how critically important early childhood education is for our kids. And so we can look at it from a childhood perspective, but also a workforce perspective, right? And so we know that third grade literacy rates determine a whole lot for our kids. Well, when 51% of our students enter kindergarten ready, they're already behind the 8 ball. And so that we can't wait until 2nd and 3rd grade to try to close that gap. That gap's got to be closed as early as possible. And so my goal is certainly to start moving towards partnerships and collaborations to figure out how we can make sure that early childhood education is available to every family in every zip code across Kentucky. Because if it's not, then that disparate opportunity is going to continue to show up in our kindergarten readiness. Right. And guess what? It stays with us all the way through the transition readiness after their senior year in high school. And so it's an investment in our kids and the future of Kentucky's economy, but it's also a critical investment for the current workforce. Right. Again, we saw in the pandemic what happened when schools and childcare could not offer services. So many women were displaced from the workforce, and so its immediate impact would be on today's workforce. The long-term effect would be a stronger economy because we're investing in our kids at the earliest age.
Right. When I first got involved in public education in the late 80s and early 90s, we were at the very beginning stages of the Kentucky Education Reform Act. And it seems like that most people in the state of Kentucky, be they business people, citizens, parents, elected officials, rallied around the cause of improving our educational system in Kentucky. Still obviously very critical, but fast forward to today and things have become, unfortunately, in government at both the state and the federal level, kind of very confrontational. So how can you and your team and the governor, working with the legislature, how can we re-rally the state leadership behind this idea of working to take our education level to an even a greater point?
Well, first let me say that is, I would say, the #1 goal of myself and Governor Beshear in our Education First administration. And also the reason why KERA was so successful back in the day is because of exactly what you said. Elected officials, community leaders, the business community, they all rallied around this cause because they understood what that investment meant long term. And we've got to get back to that notion of it really does take a village. And if our businesses want improved outcomes from high school and college as our students move on to the workforce, then that's got to be a partnership that we're all willing to come together to make. And so I would just ask elected officials and our business leaders, what kind of economy do you want? Because the future of our economy is in our classrooms today. And that is where that investment happens, and that is where we build the workforce and the economy of the future.
Last question, not necessarily education related, but it'll be fun to ask. So you've been in this role for almost 2 years. What's the biggest surprise that you've had in this job?
Biggest surprise I've had in this job? I think I would say the biggest surprise I've had in this job, especially after campaigning for about 2 years, is how similar we actually all are. I know politics a lot of times aims to divide and conquer, but we're really not all that different. And that's been proven to me time and time and time again as I've traveled the state and talked to your everyday Kentuckians about what they need and the challenges that they face. It's all very similar. And so that gives me hope that we can come together and solve those big challenges.
Well, Lieutenant Governor, we thank you for your time today. It was fun to spend a few minutes with you. Wish you luck, both you and the governor and the entire administration as we move forward. You all were dealt an interesting hand, so to speak, shortly after being inaugurated. We have this little pandemic to deal with.
Yes.
So, Personally, I want to commend you and the governor and the entire administration on the job you've done.
Thank you.
Because literally you were making this stuff up as we went along, and fortunately we found ourselves maybe beyond that and looking to bigger and brighter things, particularly in education.
I agree, and thank you so much for saying that.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
And now to Jessamine County, where I recently had the chance to sit down with the head of Kentucky's Board of Education. We're here today with Dr. Lou Young, a career educator who currently serves as the board chair of the State Board of Education. Dr. Young, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Good morning, Sam.
You've been in education probably your whole life.
Exactly.
Let's think back over the last 18 months as we've been through this once-in-a-lifetime, we hope, pandemic. How's that impacted students, teachers, schools throughout the state of Kentucky?
You know, I think we'll be looking well into the future about the impact that the pandemic has had on students and their learning, certainly on teachers and their professional careers, and just some level of trauma that we all experienced over 18 months. Two big chunks of 2 school years missing from the experiences of kids and teachers. So I think it's almost impossible to overstate how difficult the pandemic was on families, certainly on kids and on educators.
And you were a teacher and an administrator, and in March of, I guess, 2020, we slammed on the brakes and had to pivot immediately to go to the non-traditional instruction, the distance learning.
Yeah.
How difficult was that?
It was, it's really kind of surreal when I think about it. It was March 13, and we'd gotten a couple of days' notice from Governor Beshear that we were going to be out for at least 2 weeks, was the original notion. And so educators and especially school administrators started just to kind of reconceptualize what the end of the school year might look like. And then each week we saw the pandemic on the increase, started seeing the stories from New York and other places, and realizing that it was likely we weren't going to be back in school that year. So I was working with one of our school districts that I work with in UK, and I remember that day the teachers were like, okay, we got to get together our work for the next 2 weeks. We got to think about what that's going to mean, how we're going to get in touch with our kids. And so there was all this scrambling. And then all of a sudden the reality dawned that we were going to be teaching from a distance for a lot longer than 2 weeks. And so I have to just stop a minute and commend public educators all across this Commonwealth and the nation, the way they turned on a dime to provide distance learning without a lot of experience in that way, and they did it remarkably well. It was difficult. I don't want to pretend like it wasn't. It was really difficult, but they did an amazing job.
So let's look ahead to this upcoming school year. How will that be different, let's say, given what we experienced with the pandemic and the distance learning? What's going to be different compared to, say, 2 years ago?
Yeah, so I'm hoping that there will be a lot of things that are different. My team and I have been talking about, interesting you use this word in your question, how we can get back better than normal. Getting back to normal really shouldn't be our goal. We've got to learn from the experiences. The way that educators relied so heavily on families to support kids through the process is one of those examples. That's a genie we don't want to put back in the bottle. How can we really engage at home learning to impact at school learning and vice versa? That's just one example. The ability to use hybrid learning models where we have some combination of digital learning as well as the face-to-face learning that we have learned is so critically important. And another takeaway for me that I hope lasts us through the better than normal is an appreciation for our public schools and especially for our teachers that families expressed throughout the pandemic about how much they appreciated the work of our teachers who, while taking care of their own families in many cases, did all they could to reach and support kids throughout it. So I think there's some lessons that we've learned throughout the pandemic that we must capitalize on moving forward.
One of the big challenges in my mind is the fact that so many kids have suffered a pretty significant learning loss during this year and a half. How do we address that going forward? What role does the Department of Education play as compared to local districts? How do we attack that problem?
Yeah, so I kind of have a couple of branches of an answer I want to share there. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to reframe it, not so much as learning loss, but the opportunity that we have in front of us to accelerate learning. Kids were learning a lot. They were learning about caring for siblings and about taking care of themselves and about how to learn on their own and to navigate the internet to do high quality learning. So there's a lot of learning that happened. But certainly not always the kind of paced curriculum that we expected to see. So I'm encouraging the educators that we work with at UK to meet kids where they are this fall. We've had a lot of great summer school activities going on here next door in Fayette County. We've seen some really high quality, highly engaging student learning happening throughout the summer. So whatever we can do to help kids fall back in love with school, where school is once again in their quality circle, and where they actually have the chance to say, okay, this happened to us, it's not my fault as a learner, but where can we meet kids and then take them as far and as fast as they can go in the time that we have with them. I think we will always have an asterisk by 2020 in the national educational statistics, but I really believe in the resilience of kids and in the determination of educators to help ameliorate that asterisk over time.
A lot of people talk about the social emotional impact where children were stuck at home. Their world as they knew it, just everybody's world, changed dramatically. They didn't have the opportunity to see their friends. So as an educator, how do we address that problem? When kids come back to school in August, how do we deal with not only the academic piece, but the social emotional piece?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to mention earlier, and I'm so glad you asked. There's a level of trauma that many kids experienced just from the fear of a pandemic. They were watching this on the news night after night. They heard their parents talking about it. They were living in an unusual place in their lives. So there's some internalized trauma that happens there. But there's also this lack of socialization. Kids are social beasts, and they need those opportunities to be not just on a screen with friends, but face to face. So I mentioned the Fayette County Summer School Project. We did some family surveying for them, and at all three levels, elementary, middle, and high, when asked what kind of learning experiences do you want your kids to have this summer, even at the high school level, families said we want them to have the chance to be outside and to socialize with their friends. So that was a real, this is an opportunity for us to again rethink socialization and the importance of school to the development of young people. And so one of those opportunities, again, we must seize as a lesson learned, and as we move forward, think about outside wall learning and about field experiences and internships and lots of time for very productive socialization. I think those are really exciting opportunities ahead.
Let's fast forward. We're 10 years down the road and we're reflecting back on what we lived through in 2020. What's going to be, in your mind, the biggest change we're going to see in education as a result of what we've been through?
I think that one of the biggest changes will be at the policy level. I think everybody learned a lot about collaboration across agencies and the importance of having policy that defines the truly unexpected. And so I saw a lot of collaboration among public health, public education, local and state governments. I hope that defines a new way that we approach challenges that involve children and families. So I think that's one of those lasting impacts that I hope we will see. My colleague Justin Bathett and I wrote a book chapter about the importance or the difficulty that school leaders, mostly superintendents, faced in communicating through a time of crisis. They were asked to be experts in epidemiology. And they're good, solid experts in public education, but they were challenged by far with things that they just simply had to rely on colleagues to be able to make really difficult, real-time decisions. And so I think a lot of that will last moving forward. I've also done a lot of work recently around what folks are referring to as the twin pandemic of racism and the pandemic itself. And so what I'm seeing there on the equity front is that schools, districts, and certainly at the state agency, we're gearing up to look into equity as a more top-line conversation. And so we've Commissioner Glass has brought on Deputy Commissioner and Chief Equity Officer, Dr. Thomas Woods Tucker. We're seeing school districts all around the state bringing on Chief Equity Officers to have a point person who can hold the district and all of the people in that district accountable for support for all kids. So interesting that those two things have coalesced and become really kind of a twin focus for us as we move forward.
So as bad as this experience has been and as terrible for many people, you really think there's some very positive things that will come out of this?
Oh yeah, I do. I really do. And I'm kind of always grasping for silver linings perhaps, but there are, the potential is there for educators to really think differently about the schooling experience, how to engage kids, how to work more productively with the home, how to build better relationships with kids, how to tend to that whole child, the social, emotional, physical, and academic needs of that child. Those things are all in the forefront of educators' conversations today, and I really believe they'll outlast the post-COVID years.
Well, Dr. Young, thanks for giving us a few minutes today. And thank you for your service in education and your current service on the State Board of Education, because it's very important work and it impacts literally every child in the state of Kentucky.
Well, thank you. And I'm honored to do it, and I have a great board team. Love working with Dr. Glass and his team as well, and we have important work ahead.
Thank you.
We want to wish all of the students and educators in Kentucky good luck as we get back to class, and hopefully a little more back to normal. I'm Sam Corbett, and we'll see you again on Assignment Education.
Assignment Education on KET is made possible with generous support from
Cosair.org/kids.
Cosair Charities has given my daughter the opportunity to reach her full potential on everything. I know that she's destined to do great things.
Cosair.org/kids.
The Vay Neighbor Carter Group at Baird. Wealth management with quality, perspective, honesty, and integrity. The Vay Neighbor Carter Group.rwbaird.com.